I was asked today to present on the functional layers of the mind. So you're going to learn some Sanskrit words that hopefully won't intimidate you or frighten you by the end of the workshop. Maybe you're familiar with them before, maybe you've never heard them before. I am going under the assumption that this is the first time you've heard of them, but hopefully by the end you'll appreciate why they're worth knowing for your own meditation practice and even beyond meditation, just in terms of understanding how the mind works and how the mind is a tool that you can either use consciously for your own benefit and the benefit of others, for your own emancipation, or something that you are the victim of that enslaves you and keeps you bound to petty sorts of things that you have no control over, appetites and desires. And the reason why you hear so many of these terms being in the Sanskrit language is because this tradition comes out of India. You have these terms that have developed over thousands of years. And what I would say first and foremost about really any word in any language is something is always lost in the translation. I've heard before that even the best translations really only capture 80%. But when we're talking about some of the Sanskrit terms that you might be introduced to in a workshop like this, you're losing much more than 20% in the translation, because these words developed around a tradition that did not exist outside of India. And because they did not exist outside of India, these are terms that have no obvious translations. These are terms that you could read an entire book just on the meaning of one of these. And so it's worth understanding what these terms are, because they can deepen your understanding what it is that you're doing when you engage with a meditation practice, or you just engage with your mind in general. Okay, so just, I guess that can be our launching pad to start from. So here's another scary word. I promise this is the last scary word of the workshop before. So Tantra, a phenomenological approach. Yeah, that's a scary word. Phenomenology. Phenomenology is a scary sounding word that comes out of philosophy, but it means something that you're already deeply familiar with, which is that you perceive the world differently than how it often actually is. And sometimes when you learn that the world is different than you actually perceive it, you learn to sort of cancel out your experience of the world in favor for some abstract idea of how you know the world to be. And phenomenology is a philosophical practice in which you ground yourself back in your actual experience. And so all this is to say that Tantra starts with what it's actually like to be you, to be a person in this world, and what can you learn about the mind by paying very close attention to how you experience yourself and how you experience the world. So Tantra is the indigenous spiritual approach of South Asia. I'm not sure if PLT offers courses on things like the history of yoga, but the very controversial claim that I'm going to make right now is that yoga comes out of Tantra. And most people would tell you the opposite. They would tell you that Tantra is this strange aberration that came around in the Middle Ages that is not directly related to the indigenous spiritual approach of India. And I would say it's the opposite. I would say that the traditions that you associate with South Asia, the Vedic tradition, the yogic tradition, the core out of which everything else springs actually is Tantra. And phenomenology is a fancy word used in philosophy that means understanding the world as it feels and as it appears to us, okay? So one of the more obvious examples that often gets cited in understanding phenomenology is the sensation of being in a car and driving down the road. When you're in a car driving down the road, you know, in an abstract sense, that you are traveling through the world. You're the one who's traveling through the world. You know that that's true, but that's actually not how it feels to you if you ground yourself in your experience, because you're sitting still. If you're going 100 kilometers down the road, you're actually traveling 100 kilometers down the road, but that's not how it feels phenomenologically to you. It feels to you like you're sitting still. And so phenomenologically, it doesn't feel like you're moving through the world. It feels like the world is moving past you and you're sitting still. And so that's what I mean by how phenomenology often flips the way that we understand the world, because it grounds us back in our experience. And there's a value to knowing abstractly what might be happening, but there's also a value in grounding ourselves back in our experience, because it teaches us something about our experience. It teaches us something about the way in which we perceive the world. It teaches us something about the mind, which often gets taken for granted. We act as though our minds are these perfectly reliable narrators that just show us reality as it is, that there's no filter between our minds and reality, and that transition is a very smooth one. But in reality, our minds are the ultimate unreliable narrators. They're not to be trusted. They are playing tricks on us all the time. And our experience of the world is deeply conditioned by the cognitive distortions that we carry around with us that we're usually not aware of. And so Tantra, which is the practice, I would say, of training the mind to liberate itself from all sorts of narrowness and all sorts of things that bind it and limit it, therefore necessarily possesses this kind of phenomenological approach that grounds us back in our experience and makes us aware of our experience so that we can learn to use the mind in an emancipatory way. So Tantra asks the essential question, I would say, which is, how do we experience the world? What does this experience tell us about the nature of the mind? And so when I explain just ahead the different functional layers of the mind, I'm going to attempt to explain them to you through the example of what it's like to experience just this lecture online. And by carefully working through how you are perceiving this video and my voice and the experience of being in the room that you're in, you can see the different layers of the mind at work. And once you become aware of them, then that's where it becomes a reality for you to be able to use the mind in a conscious way for your own purpose, instead of being used by the mind whenever some thing comes up that triggers you and makes you run down some path that you don't necessarily want to take. Okay, and so this slide I call I don't know what just happened to my slideshow. That was weird. The whole thing now longer, it feels like it's zoomed in on my computer. Are you all getting that also? Is the text being cut out?
Yes, part of when it first came up, I could see the chitta as you think so you become. Now the as is off to the left.
All right, let me try that again. I don't know what happened. Okay, now it's fine.
There, that's fine.
Okay, so the chitta is the first part of the mind that I want to talk about. And it relates to this quote that maybe you've heard of before that is integral to our meditation practice, which is, as you think, so you become. So I'm going to start with you perceiving my voice right now, you being here in a room and watching this video. How are you perceiving me? How are you perceiving this video? Okay. And so to start in the most basic sense, light is reflecting off the monitor. It's bouncing off the monitor. It reaches your eye. It creates, this vibration in your optical nerve, which sends a signal to your brain. That's all physical. That's a crude, mechanistic way of understanding the act of perception. But once this image is created in your brain, what happens? Okay. So there's already something that you're probably not aware of, which is that your eye actually will show you an upside down image, but you don't know it because your mind is very good at flipping it so that you don't recognize that you're being shown an upside down image. And so once that process happens, you now have an image in your mind of my voice, of me, of the slideshow, okay? And so the most important thing to understand about this part of the active perception is that the mind becomes like what it is perceiving, okay? So it's helpful sometimes to even think of this part of the mind as if it's a ball of Play-Doh or silly putty, okay? In order for you to understand what I'm saying, there's a part of your mind that has to become my voice. And then you can hear whether I have a deep voice or a high-pitched voice, and how you can understand my words and understand them in a deeper sense. All of that happens because there is a portion of the mind that becomes like what you are perceiving. There's one part of the mind that becomes the object of perception, and then there's another part of the mind that looks at it and figures out, oh, what's happening here? In order to assimilate information, there's a part of your mind that has to become like what you are perceiving, okay? And that's why foundational to the understanding of what meditation is and why it works is the idea of as you think, so you become. Because the mind has to become its objects of perception, it necessarily will begin to be influenced by the things that it perceives all the time. And once you recognize that, you realize that it becomes very important to pay very close attention to what you are focusing your mind on. We understand in a very crude sense psychologically that if we think all day with this negative self-talk, with this sort of fixed mindset, I'm so this, I'm so that, I'm so ugly, my nose is so this, I'm not smart enough, I can't do it. If you tell yourself this stuff all day long, then you won't be able to do anything. We all understand that in a very crude psychological sense. But part of the reason why that is so is because the mind becomes like what it thinks about. And the more you're able to emancipate and liberate your mind from all sorts of narrow ideas, whether they are narrow ideas in that they limit you, or whether they are narrow ideas in that they limit your way of thinking and keep you boxed into small dogmas and prejudices. The more you are able to liberate the mind from those sorts of shackles, the more the mind is able to expand, and the more the mind becomes subtler and more powerful. And all of that is just by becoming aware of the fact that your mind becomes like what it thinks about. It becomes like what it perceives. So this mind stuff, the stuff of the mind that has to become like what it perceives, the objective part of your mind, objective because it becomes like the object, and it is not the subject that is watching everything, is known in Sanskrit as the chitta. And I hope already you can appreciate why it's important to understand these Sanskrit terms sometimes, because there's just no translation for chitta. Objective portion of the mind, what the heck do I mean by that? Mind stuff, that's an even weirder term. It's worth taking the effort to understand what we mean by these terms, because by learning these terms, we're introducing ourselves into a heritage and a tradition and a lineage that goes back thousands of years. These words are not new inventions. They have extremely long histories behind them. And by learning the word, you introduce yourself to the very intelligent and wise people who've been thinking about these ideas for millennia. And so this objective portion of the mind shows how important it is to control the mind. The mind becomes like its objects. And so the presence of the chitta in a living being is what gives rise to instinct. And so instinct is sort of naturally encoded knowledge. Humans actually have very few true instincts. When you were born, you had the instinct to grasp, for example, to suck. Babies or newborn babies have the instinct to follow things with their eyes. But humans have very few instincts. Animals have many more, some of which are truly remarkable. Instinct, I'm a teacher, and I teach 5th and 6th graders, and I teach science. And I often like to tell my kids that instinct is a magic word that scientists use to cover up the fact that they don't know what the heck is going on. How is a spider able to create such a majestic and geometrically perfect web? By using a word like instinct, we're able to cover up our ignorance. We just say, oh, well, that's instinct, as if that explains anything. But instinct comes from, in yogic philosophy, or this philosophy, I should say, it comes from the presence of this objective portion of the mind. It is the crudest part of the mind. And so here's a quote it comes from the Dhammapada, which is a set of Buddhist scriptures. This is one of the very few Buddhist scriptures that is actually attributed to the Buddha himself, and is supposedly at least based off his actual teachings and sayings. This is the very first verse on the very first page. And so this just shows how foundational this is to a meditation practice, or any practice of self-development, is understanding the power of the mind and its power over you. If you do not take the seat in that chariot of the mind, you are what you think, having become what you thought. And that comes out of the Dhammapada. Okay, and so this is a graphic image that I'm going to be developing upon. Very first step is we understand this chitta. It becomes like the objects of its experience, and it's responsible for the rise of instinct in a living being. So next, we're going to be talking about the one subtler layer, which is, I've mentioned it all before, that there's this part of your mind that becomes like its objects of perception, but then there's another part of the mind, the subject, that is looking and recognizing what the chitta is becoming like. And that's what's known as the aham, or the aham tattva in Sanskrit. And it is your sense of individual doership, the part of you that says, I will perceive this, I won't perceive that, I will do this, I won't do that. So the objective mind, which is the chitta, requires a subject that is outside of it, that is recognizing the objects of perception. And so the fact that you see anything proves that there is a subtler part of the mind that chooses to see one thing over another. And so, in other words, the fact that there is a chitta proves that there is an aham.
Amal?
Yes?
Just a brief break here to let us know that the Spanish translation is now available.
Okay. Then I will try desperately to slow down. So this subjective part of the mind is known as the aham. This ego, or sense of doership, gives one a sense that one is separate or different from others. It has likes and dislikes. It has preferences and prejudices. So it is also the part of the mind that experiences pleasure or pain. So let's give you an example to show the power of the aham. Okay, so this is a relatively universal experience. Suppose you're in the room and you're thinking very hard about something. Let's say that you're recounting a conversation you had with a friend earlier that day that was very embarrassing, that was awkward, and you're not sure how you spoke with your friend, and you're sort of playing it over in your mind. Okay, you might be in a room where there's all sorts of things happening around you, and your eyes might be in perfect working order, but your chitta is not necessarily taking the shape of what you are seeing. Because you are so absorbed in thought, your chitta is taking the shape of all the things that your friend and you said to each other, and your feelings about it. And in the middle of that process, you might have, your father or your mother walk into the room trying to get your attention. And even though they're within your field of vision, and even though there's nothing wrong with your eye, and even though there's nothing wrong with your brain, you don't see them. You don't notice that they're there. And the reason for that is because the aham is currently obsessed with its conversation, that it had with its friend earlier that day. And so the chitta is taking the shape of what the aham wants and becomes like the friend, and is repeating what the friend said and repeating how you feel about it over and over again. And because it is not taking the shape of your mother or father who walked in the door, you don't recognize that they're there right away. And so that is a small example that shows the power that you have in your aham to choose to do one thing over another. There is a level of control that you have over your mind, and it's very difficult to exercise. I believe it was the Buddhists, to illustrate the unwieldy aspects of the mind. They liken the mind to a monkey that is drunk, that has been stung by a scorpion and is stuck in a cage. And that's what your mind is like. I love that image because it sort of shows the desperate restlessness to the mind. And so when somebody is starting out meditating and somebody teaches them, okay, close your eyes, withdraw your mind in this way, imagine these things, repeat this phrase, it can often be very difficult at first. And that's because there's no mental training that's given to most people to learn how to take ownership and take control of this mind of theirs. I would say that the entire society encourages you to be totally asleep to how the mind works. The way that is profitable for society is for you to move on instinct according to whatever appetite arises in your mind, so that when you receive an advertisement telling you to purchase some project to alleviate some existential anxiety of yours, you just obey and you immediately purchase what they are telling you to purchase. And that sense of that relief of anxiety you feel when you get the Amazon box at the door, you think is what mental peace feels like. But of course, that's not what mental peace feels like. Mental peace comes from having mastery over your mind, so that you're not a slave to whatever stupid thing arises in this very often very stupid mind of yours. And so I think it's helpful to think of the mind the way that we already think of the body. If I spend my entire life sitting on a couch, eating potato chips, there's a basic understanding that I'm going to turn into a useless pile of garbage, physically, okay? If similarly, the mind needs to be trained. If you mentally are spending your entire life sitting on the couch, eating mental potato chips, it's going to be worthless, okay? And so the same way that if you decide that you're going to get your body into shape and you go into the gym, you might have to start with very light weights. If I were to give you, 100-pound dumbbells, it would be too much for you. You would hurt yourself. And the same thing goes for the mind, okay? It is very natural when you sit down for meditation, if you don't have a lot of experience with it, to feel this is very difficult. But by training your mind over time, by putting in the effort the same way that you would have to if you wanted to physically train your body, you develop your mind and it becomes stronger. And you develop very, very, very slowly a sense of ownership over the mind, and a sense of self-control and self-mastery. And that is more important, in my opinion, than the physical aspects of upkeep that we are already familiar with and we already understand the importance of. However important it is to take care of your body, it is that much more important to learn how to take care of your mind. And so finally, I would say in this slide that the surplus of the aham over the chitta, if there is a stronger sense of doership than there is of whatever the mind is perceiving, we call that intellect. And so, all living beings possess a chitta and possess some form of instinct. Not all living beings possess intellect. Only highly evolved or highly developed organisms possess a sense of intellect. If I lay down a trap for most animals, animals easily fall into a trap, and it's harder to. Similarly, if I put down some tasty, your favorite food down in the middle of the forest with a net underneath it. Most humans will come up to this and go, this is suspicious. What's going on here? And that's because they have some intellectual faculties, but even among humans, many humans, the moment they see their favorite thing goes, ooh, my favorite thing, and, jump all over it and fall into the trap. And that's what I would call modern advertising. Okay. So developing this graphic one level further, we start with the chitta, and then we move on to the aham, the sense of doership and the intellect. And so next, the mahat. Okay, so let's talk about this. The fact that there is a little subject with your name on it that likes some things and doesn't like other things. The only reason why that part of your mind can be active is because there is something much subtler behind the scenes. And that is a pure existential awareness. It's like a feeling, a very, very, very pure, unfiltered feeling of I exist. You can imagine that feeling almost like when you wake up in the morning and you open your eyes in this tiny little instant before you remember who you are, where you are, what you're doing, and what you like and what you don't like, and what's going on in your life. There's this pure sense of I exist. And that's the mahat. That's the subtlest function of the mind. And that is the baseline that's required for everything else to be happening. I cannot do anything unless I feel that I exist. Okay? So the fact that there is a part of the mind that has a sense of ego, of I do this or that, proves that there is a subtler part of the mind that is aware that it exists. And this pure feeling of I exist is known as the mahat or the mahat tattva in Sanskrit. If you dive into this stuff, you might find the word buddhi tattva as well, especially in the Buddhist tradition. And so this portion of the mind is so subtle that it transcends our sense of individuality. It is an absolutely pure feeling of I exist. And so what I mean by it transcends your sense of individuality, the part of the mind that experiences pleasure and pain, the part of the mind that feels like it is an author, that it does some things and not other things, that it likes some things and other things. Basically, everything that you tend to associate with your identity is all located in the chitta and the aham. Once you move into the mahat, there's no sense of distinction. There's no sense of, I am this person, I am that person, I like this, I don't like that, I like vanilla, I don't like chocolate. That's not the mahat. The subtlest portion of the mind transcends that sense of individuality. It is a pure existential awareness. And so the surplus of the mahat over aham, if you are more in touch with this deepest aspect of being than you are with your ego, that creates intuition. That gives you a direct connection to something that is at the ground of your being that transcends individuality. And that intuitional knowledge, I gave a whole talk about it recently, I think can be most recognized by its moral dimension. I would call it a non-rational awareness in every moment of what is the right thing to do and how to help others and how to be a vehicle for emancipation, evolution, and welfare in the world, instead of being a small, petty person who is constantly looking out for his or her selfish pleasures. And so we start with the chitta and instinct. Outside of that is a subjective part of the mind that has a sense of doership or authorship, and that gives rise to intellect. And then even subtler than that, there's a pure existential feeling that gives rise to intuition if we are able to get in touch with it. And now this is, I would say, the trickiest part, is understanding what comes next. This is what's called in Sanskrit the Atman. This is a widely known word, I would say. Maybe you've heard it before. It often gets translated to be the self. I personally like calling it the ground of being. And the reason for that is that if I use the word self, talk about something lost in translation, most of us will associate ourselves with very petty and superficial parts of ourselves. aspects of ourselves that are in no way permanent. If I associate myself, with the fact that I'm a man, for example, who I am runs much deeper than my gender. And the proof that my identity runs much deeper than my gender is that if my identity was grounded purely in my sense of being a man, then I wouldn't be able to relate to women. I wouldn't be able to relate to anybody who has a different gender expression. And so that proves that my sense of self runs deeper than that. And I think that most of us, even when we think of our souls, we think of our souls as intimately bound up with basically, our likes and our dislikes. The fact that I am a writer seems like it's a part of my soul, even in a colloquial sense. But what we're talking about here is much, much, much deeper. All of that stuff that I think is so important about me is just in my chitta and just in my aham. Even in my own mind, who I am runs deeper than that. That sense of existential awareness runs deeper than my age or my nationality or my race or what bands I like and what movies I don't like. And so that's personally why I like to call it the ground of being. Everything arises out of this, the Atman. And so, before I start, actually, I'm going to tell you about a Western philosopher whose name you've maybe heard of before. His name was René Descartes. He was a philosopher from France, and he was obsessed with trying to figure out what you could know for sure. He existed in a time in which everything was being called into question because there was this thing happening called the scientific revolution, where essentially before we used to think that the universe revolved around the earth, and astronomers and philosophers were beginning to realize that that the universe didn't revolve around the world, that everything was revolving around the sun. And that flip of consciousness, recognizing that things don't just revolve around you, basically upended everybody's perspective. Everything was called into question once that was true. And so Descartes wanted to know what he knew for sure, what was definitely true no matter what. That skepticism he applied ruthlessly. He even wanted to question things that feel truly certain, like, how can I know for sure that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? You don't know that for sure. So he would throw that out. And he would throw out everything that he couldn't know for sure until he found one thing that he knew for sure. And the only thing that he could know for sure is that he knew that he existed. He can't know for sure that you exist. You might just be some weird trick that's being played on my consciousness, but I know that I exist. Similarly, you know that you exist. That's the only thing that can be known with any true certainty. And I would say that this philosophy is in complete agreement with Descartes, at least on this one tiny point. You are sure that you exist. You know that you exist. But that feeling of I know that I exist shows that there is an entity outside the mind. Here's your mind. It's outside the mind and it witnesses the mind. And because it sees the mind, it gives your mind a sense of certainty, a sense of knowership, a sense of I know that I exist. Descartes actually, by the way, believed the same thing. He said that this proved that there was a God. Okay, the fact that you have a feeling that I know that I exist shows that there's a witness to your existence. And the fact that there is a witness to your existence grants your existence with some substance. The Sanskrit translation of the aphorism that deals with this is witnesship grants substantiation. If you do something and absolutely nobody ever recognizes it, it's almost as if it didn't happen. Even at the quantum level, maybe this is going too deep, but light behaves like a wave until there is a witness to it, and then it behaves like a particle. Witnesship is integral to the way that this universe works, even at a mechanistic physical level, and certainly at a psychic level. There is your mind, which takes its objects of perception and becomes like it. There's a subject that tells it what to do and what not to do. There is a very deeper sense of subjectivity that has a pure feeling of I exist. And that feeling that you know that you exist proves that there is a witness outside of the mind that witnesses the mind and gives that mind substance, certainty of knowership. And so that witnessing consciousness, which is subtler than even the subtlest parts of the mind, is known in Sanskrit as the Atman, or the self. And if you notice, I'm capitalizing the self. And the reason for that is we're not talking about your petty sense of self that's insulted when somebody doesn't say please or thank you. We're talking about the deepest identity, something that is so deep that it transcends even your humanity, that transcends everything you know about yourself. There is a part of you that goes deeper than that, that is eternal, that is fundamental to the ground of being. And everything you think you are arises out of that as a sort of temporary play. It's like a mask that the Atman is wearing, in order to learn some tiny thing about what it means to be an entity in this universe. But it's extremely limited, this mask that you wear. And if you can learn to peel back this mask and eventually take off the mask, you become aware of your true identity, which is connected to everything. It's a knowledge of interconnection and embeddedness, a sense that you are a part of everything, that you are not separate from everything. You're not some atomized consumer alone. You're something more than that. And so we start with the chitta, we move on to the sense of doership or authorship. Beyond that is a pure feeling of I exist. And beyond the mind is a pure consciousness out of which everything springs. Okay, and so what I would say is that this perspective, which is grounded in the way that you experience the world, it's not grounded in some sort, it's not like I told you, here's some scripture and this is what it says. There's a rational logic that you can work through in your own mind that shows that this is how you experience the world. I would say that it shows that our ordinary mechanistic way of looking at the world, our ordinary materialistic way of looking at the world is backwards. So what do I mean by that? If you were to ask most scientists, not all scientists, but most scientists, where does consciousness come from? They would say that the brain is like this piece of hardware that generates consciousness, which is like its software. Basically, consciousness is a sort of accidental byproduct of the chemical interactions of the brain. And when the brain ceases to be, consciousness does not survive. Consciousness is like a strange aberration in the cosmos. It's this weird thing that doesn't really serve a purpose, and it accidentally comes from the brain, and the brain creates it. And I would say that this perspective is exactly backwards to the one that I'm sharing with you right now, because we started with the chitta, and so it seems like out of the chitta comes the aham, out of the aham comes the mahat, out of the mahat comes that consciousness, but that's the exact opposite, okay? The ground of being is the Atman, and everything comes out of that. Everything you think you know, everything you think you know about yourself, and everything you experience in the world is a form that Atman is temporarily taking. But the ultimate sense of identity is grounded in that Atman, and not in some accidental chemical byproduct in a brain that happened for accidental reasons, which is the materialist perspective. And the process of meditation is learning to systematically withdraw the mind back into the Atman. By learning to control what the chitta is concentrating upon, meditation is a systematic process by which you learn to merge the chitta into the aham. That's why meditation, if you learn it, is not about emptying the mind, because you can't empty the mind. The nature of the mind is to take an object and to become like its object. If I tell you to close your eyes and I say you're allowed to think about anything you want in the whole world, and there's only one rule, you can't imagine a pink elephant, everybody imagines a pink elephant because that's what the mind is like. And so in the process of meditation, you're not told to clear the mind. You are given something for your mind to concentrate upon. Meditation is not emptying the mind, it is concentrated thinking. And that's why they're given a process of withdrawal, a process of visualization and imagination, and a phrase and an ideation to go along with that to center the mind's concentration so that it becomes like something that is subtler than mere instinctual interface with the world. And so the chitta can be withdrawn into the sense of doership. And similarly, that sense of doership that makes you feel like you are so special, such a unique and special snowflake, can be withdrawn into the subtlest parts of the mind. And once that happens, the Mahat is similarly able to be taken back and folded into the grounded being from which you fundamentally arise and into which you participate in your truest sense of self. And so that is something that you have some power over. Perhaps it's very difficult to imagine being able to withdraw the mind into the subtlest aspects of being. But every one of us understands that we have habits and mental habits that are unhelpful and keep us limited. And the process of Tantra is about liberating the mind from those tendencies. And that is something that you can start today. That's something that you can practice, not just when you're sitting down and practicing your meditation, but when you are embedded in your relationships in the world. If I come across my spouse and I decide that I'm going to behave in a petty and selfish way because I have some strange resentment and I need to win, okay, I'm keeping myself trapped in an extremely narrow sense of identity. I will never be able to transcend my ego and ground myself in a deeper aspect of being if I'm stuck at that extremely selfish level of experiencing the world. And so that's why morality and how you are in your social relationships are the foundation of your spiritual practice. And why Sri Anandamurti says that without morality, spiritual practice is an impossibility. And that is what I have for you today. I sincerely hope that there was something of value from it and that you didn't find the terms too alienating eventually. So thank you very much for your attention. It's the most precious thing that you have to share. Thank you.